Hey guys, so I've had a lot of requests asking about working out the return on investment on various marketing projects. So I thought I'd put together this PowerPoint lecture on how you figure out whether or not the ROI or the return on investment you're proposing in your marketing campaign is reasonable or not, and how conversion rates might work in with some of the mental arithmetic that you're going to have to go through to try and figure out the return on investment in your marketing campaign. So just to recap, let's talk about return on investment. In an earlier lecture on advertising budgeting and how to allocate the budget and therefore how to calculate the return on investment, we went through this formula here, which is a common return on investment formula. So you've got the profit that you hope to make minus the marketing investment or ad spend or whatever cost it was to implement the campaign, divided by that marketing investment, times that by 100, that gives you a return on investment percentage, right? So one of the examples I talked about in the lecture was, let's say you spent $1,500 on some sort of media or campaign or whatever it is, some marketing investment, and you made $2,000 of profit based on that investment. So you go 2,000 minus 1,500 divided by 1,500 gives you 0.33, multiplied by 100 gives you a return on investment percentage of 33%. So that means for every dollar you put in, you get 33 cents back, which doesn't sound like much, but if you compare the average investment interest rates around 3 to 4%, then 33% is massive, right? So that's a really good investment or return on your investment. So how do you know, though, with that formula, what the profit is, right? So that's kind of like the golden question. If you're only proposing a marketing campaign, how do you know what profit you're actually going to make? And therefore, how do you know the return on investment you're trying to calculate? Because the profit is a very important part of that equation. So, spoiler alert, you don't, right? Unless you have actual retrospective sales data, you never know how much profit you're going to make on any proposed marketing campaign. So that means you need to guess or estimate. So this is where this idea of conversion rates are really important. So what is a conversion rate? The way I like to think of it is that it's basically a percentage or rate of people that do what you want them to do after they see your ad or hear your ad or are somehow exposed to your ad. So usually you hear metrics like, click-through rate, CTR. We've also worked with other metrics like CPM, cost per thousand. Then there are other sort of, I guess, engagement ratings like number of likes, or maybe even something more tangible like signing up to a certain, newsletter or something like that. So some of those can be thought of as a conversion, but realistically, a conversion rate should always be about sales, right? How do you actually ring that till given the marketing investment that you've put into a campaign? So if we think about sales or behavioral response that results in the company making some money out of converting a ad view into an actual purchase, that's the best way of thinking about conversion rates. So just as a very basic example, let's say you've spent some money and you have an ad where 100 people see this ad, right? And let's say 5 of those 100 people that see your ad actually convert or buy your product. So this means that 5 divided by 100 times 100 gives you 5%. So your conversion rate is 5%. So once you have this 5%, this conversion rate, then you can actually calculate the sales, right? Because you know that 5% of that population are likely to buy your product. And if you know what that number is in terms of what 5% equals, then you know how many sales you're going to make. And if you know how much profit you make per unit of sales, you can actually then populate the rest of the return on investment calculation that we just talked about in the previous slide. So another question is, though, well, how do you know what the conversion rate is before you launch the campaign? Well, another spoiler alert, you don't, because you're only guessing that a certain number of the 100 for this particular example would buy your product. So in this case, 5 people bought your product. But until those 5 people buy the product, you really don't know how many are going to buy the product, right? So once again, it comes down to trying to make a reasonable assumption as to what's going to happen. So in terms of marketing conversion rates, as I mentioned before, retrospective data is the most accurate because this actually shows you the number of people that bought your product, the number of sales that were made based on whoever has viewed or interacted with your ad in the first place. And that's why social media is such a popular tool now, because you can literally track the number of conversions that each interaction with your social media advertising is having. With traditional media, like traditional TV broadcasting or radio or even a billboard, conversion rates are far more difficult to ascertain because you don't know if 10,000 people drive past your billboard and 10,000 people see that billboard. You don't know how many of those people are actually going to go swing by the supermarket and buy your brand of toilet paper, for example. So those conversion rates then have to be kind of estimated in some way that seems reasonable. And I'm going to go through a few processes that you can do to try and come up with a reasonable assumption. But obviously the best thing is using retrospective data. If you can't get that because the campaign hasn't been launched yet, then you're going to have to go to secondary data. And that normally is good enough, but you have to always know or always keep in the back of your mind that the secondary data you see is not based on your unique situation or your client's unique situation. And so you always have to take these conversion numbers into with a grain of salt to make sure that you're not being overly optimistic or in some cases overly conservative. So here is some information from that website down below. I'd invite you to visit that website. It's got some really good information. But what they've done is they've looked at the average conversion rate for Facebook per industry. So this is really important because different industries mean there are different customers within those industries, and it also means that the conversion rate is going to be different because people's motivations, their behavioral response, the window of opportunity, all of that changes and depends on the sector or the industry you're working in. And so if you look at this table here, which I sourced from that website below, you'll see, for example, people within the home improvement industry, the ads, social media ads on Facebook in the home improvement industry have a 6.56 conversion rate. So that's pretty good. So for every 100 people that see a home improvement ad on Facebook, 6 of those, approximately 6 to 7 of those, will actually end up converting in some way. And usually that means like purchasing something, right? And then depending on the industry, this conversion rate, goes down or goes up. So industrial services, obviously 0.71, which would indicate that maybe if you're, selling industrial services, that maybe Facebook isn't the way to go, right? Maybe some other sort of medium. The average down the bottom right-hand corner of the table, you'll see that the average Facebook conversion rate is 9.21. So that's nearly 10%, which is, pretty high. So that means 1 in every 10 people on average that see an ad on Facebook in any one of those industries will actually convert and do something that ad is asking them to do. Here's some other stats from Adobe. They did a 2020 report on consumer electronics, so as part of their overall report, though, they had this one particular slide, which you can get if you go to that website below, looking at, once again, different sectors or different industries and what the conversion rates are based on sort of online media. So gifts, very high, and that kind of makes sense. So about 5% of people, when they're visiting a website or looking up something online, will convert and do something about that, buy that gift for that person they're thinking of. But in terms of consumer electronics, it's very low. So just because you're looking at or interacting with some sort of ad on the internet to do with consumer electronics does not mean that you'll necessarily convert and buy those consumer electronics. And that makes sense because consumer electronics is a fairly high involvement process, and a lot of the times people want to go into the store and talk to someone, have a look at the actual thing before making that decision, and hence the conversion rate from an online perspective is quite low for consumer electronics. So aside from using secondary data on the internet or some other way of figuring out what the proposed conversion rate might be for any given medium, what are some other methods? Well, one thing previous groups can do, and some agencies in industry used to do, is pre-testing. So what that means is you're conducting research on some version of your ad or some version of your market campaign to try and figure out, what people might intend to do when they encounter your ad. So this means, asking people to consider what they would do if they saw your ad on a certain medium, or maybe asking them to assess different versions of your ad. So an example here would be, imagine seeing ad 1 on a billboard. How likely are you going to purchase the product? And then you may have other questions like, imagine seeing this other version, ad 2, on a billboard. How likely would you purchase the product then? And then you could go through the same process looking at the various media that you're proposing to use in your ad campaign, right? You should also consider things like time frames, right? So when you're asking them whether they would consider buying your product or not after seeing your ad, are we talking about within the next time they need that product, or are we talking about within a week, or in several weeks, or maybe after a month, right? So this essentially takes the form of a survey or a questionnaire. So you have to think ahead about the types of questions you want to ask in order to get the data that you're going to need to be able to back up the conversion rate that you're coming up with. So let's say you've got 100 friends and you send them a survey with the ad that you've created for your campaign. And then you ask them, if you saw this ad on a billboard on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely would you purchase this product within the next week, for example, or within the next 2 weeks, etc., etc. Then you might ask the same question again about, okay, what if you saw this ad on TV? What would your response be then? What if you saw this ad on a Facebook ad, etc., etc. And so you can see by asking the survey and a certain sample of people those sorts of questions, you start to get an idea of what the purchase intention might be for that product or that service, given that the ads you've created are seen within a certain medium. Now, what are some problems with this approach of pretesting? Well, obviously it's still self-report data, right? You're basically asking people to imagine seeing your ad and then imagine what they might do as a result of seeing that ad in some imagined medium. So, if they're your friends, then they might think, oh, well, I don't want to make you feel bad, and so I'm going to say, I'm really intending to buy this product because your ad is so nice. And it's not going to be externally valid to what will actually happen in the real world. So whenever there's self-report data, particularly if you're surveying your acquaintances, there's going to be some of that bias that's going to make the data less reliable than it should be, or less valid as well. The time and effort, just me describing how you might have to survey 100 of your friends or acquaintances and then come up with a survey, that's just not feasible for a lot of you students, and it is also very unreasonable to expect that all agencies will embark on this sort of pretesting just to propose a certain marketing campaign. And so this is not done very often. But in saying that, some of my groups have done that in the past. Students have actually asked 200 of their friends and come up with data to try and support the conversion rate that they think they can get with the ad that they've come up with. So that's certainly one method if you find that the secondary data is not quite fitting the unique situation that you feel your advertising campaign is in. And finally, another method of trying to figure out this conversion rate is just through hypothesizing, and this I suspect will be the easiest and probably the most popular way for students to try and come up with a reasonable return on investment by coming up with a reasonable conversion rate. And so what I'm asking you here to do is just imagine you and 10 of your friends, right? Or just imagine a group of maybe 20 of your friends. Now, if they saw that ad, how many of them would actually do what you're asking them to do? So this is the conversion rate question, right? Now, if you said that 1 in 10 of your friends would actually do what you're asking them to do in your ad, that's a 10% conversion rate, which is really high. That's incredibly high. It's almost too good to be true, a 10% conversion rate, in my opinion, unless you can really convince me that your creative idea is so good that they can't say no to it, or you've got some other promotional element that that makes the cost to benefit trade-off of doing what you want them to do too attractive to say no to. So I usually think that less than 5% is more realistic. Any bigger than that, and we start to really scrutinize as to why you think you can provide a conversion rate over 5%. Anything less than 1% means that you're maybe being a little bit too harsh on yourself, or it could be that you don't have confidence in your creative campaign. Because I guess realistically, the more confident you are that you've come up with a really good ad and a really good marketing campaign, the more confident you should be that your conversion rate is going to be pretty good, or at least acceptable. But each case is unique. So whether you go with secondary data, or whether you hypothesize here, or whether you're thinking about pre-testing, every single group has got a slightly different approach to the way they're going to launch their marketing campaign. And that's why the return on investment for every single group should be different. And the conversion rates for every single group will be different as well. So every case is unique. And so this is really an exercise, not in terms of getting 100% correct answers, because there is no 100% foolproof method of predicting what conversion rates and return on investment would be. You can't do that. If you were able to do that, you make billions of dollars, because you're basically saying you can forecast the future success of any campaign. So given that we know that it's impossible, we're not going to really scrutinize every single detail that you make to try and trip you up and say that your return on investment should have been 34% rather than 28%, right? We're really kind of more interested in your reasoning and how you've come up with the data to support the rationale that you're actually presenting to us when you try to convince us that your conversion rate is going to be 3.5% or 7% or even 10%. Right, so we want to really see how you justify your reasons. So how do you link conversion rates to ROI now that we figured out some ways of looking at conversion rates? So you can go secondary data like those figures that I showed you, or you can make your own pre-test, make your own primary research, or you can just try and hypothesize reasonably. But once you have these conversion rates, you can try and start linking them to return on investment. And I've got two examples here using two different media. So for using medium one, for argument's sake, I've got the icon there to represent social media. Let's say it costs $15,000 to launch a marketing campaign on social media. Now let's say this campaign reaches 100,000 people. And let's say the conversion rate is 3%, which seems like a reasonable number, particularly based on the secondary data that we saw in the previous slides, right? So this means that for $15,000 that you spent on the social media, you can sell 3,000 units, because 3,000 is 3% of 100,000 people that you've reached, okay? So if you figure out the profit from 3,000 units, which all of you can do because that information is usually provided in the brief or if you're working with clients, then you could theoretically work out the return on investment, right? Because you've got the profit that you make from the 3,000 units. You know the marketing investment was 15,000 in this case, right? So that divided by $15,000 investment again, multiplied by 100 will give you a return on investment for that particular medium. If we compare that to medium number two, the icon there I have suggests it's broadcast TV. So let's say it's $80,000 to launch an ad on TV, and that reaches 50,000 people. But for some reason, that conversion rate is 10%, right? So you've done a really convincing, glamorous, creative TV ad, and it's got a huge conversion rate of 10%. So that means that for the $80,000 you spent on your TV campaign, you're selling 5,000 units, right? So once again, you know what the profit is from 5,000 units, and you can work out the return on investment for that medium. Now, there's a couple of reasons I'm comparing one medium to another medium, and that is because often the really good groups come up with very detailed return on investments and conversion rates for every single media that they're using. And why that is really attractive to clients is because all of a sudden they can see your entire IMC campaign and they can think, okay, well, medium one, social media, has a really good return on investment, whereas medium two does not have such a good return on investment. So instead of spending $80,000 in medium two, what if we just take that and put it into medium one, which is the social media, which has a really good return on investment. And that allows them to make those decisions on the fly, because they can see everything broken up. Now we realize that an IMC, or an integrated marketing communications campaign, relies on everything being integrated. And so you're trying to sell the whole package, and you would have done this thinking beforehand. Why else would you be spending $80,000 on medium two if you didn't truly believe it would help in some way? But by providing these two separate metrics by which the client can compare and contrast the different media, you're giving them the option to say, actually, no, we don't want the TV. Let's just spend all that money into social media, right? And so that just gives them that extra level of flexibility based on the thinking that you've invested. Overall, however, it's important that we have an overall campaign return on investment figure. And this is because once we take into account the entire IMC campaign, we can say, okay, given the $200,000 we're spending, this is the return on investment. And it's the average of all the different media that has been calculated prior to that. And that gives us the overall picture. So some other considerations moving forward in terms of conversion rates and return on investment. So you could consider worst to best case scenarios, right? So what some groups do in the past is they say, okay, worst case scenario, we get these conversion rates, very low, and this is the return on investment therefore we will get, because we're converting less, we're selling less, we're making less profit, but the cost is still the same, we're still spending the same budget, and so worst case, we get this return on investment. However, there's a conservative scenario here, which is a middle of the line scenario, and then there's an optimistic best case scenario, and where the conversion rates are for some reason higher. Maybe your creative idea actually works a lot better than you would expect it to, and that's what the best case scenario return on investment could be. So that's another option. You know, all of this means that you just have to put more thinking and effort into it, because now instead of coming up with one return on investment figure, you're coming up with multiple return on investment figures across best, worst, and middle case scenarios. The other thing you can consider is short and long-term forecasts, right? So in some cases, the return on investment in the short term might not be very attractive, particularly if you're launching a new brand and you need to generate that brand awareness in the first place. So you might show a return on investment based on conversion rates that are quite low in the first year, but then as brand awareness builds, conversion rates might, increase. People build more familiarity with it, they have more confidence in the brand, and therefore long term, in 3 years time, the return on investment might be quite different. So that's another approach you could take to try and argue your way out of a really poor return on investment in the initial short-term period. Consider your target market. So a highly targeted campaign should really equate to a higher conversion rate, right? Because what you're saying is that we're going to focus on these people and really sell to them the value of our brand. And because we're being highly targeted, we should create a creative campaign that really resonates with that particular target market. And because it resonates so well with them, we're going to find it a lot easier to convert those specific people rather than reaching out to a mass of people that don't really find your brand or product relevant, right? So considering your target market might help to increase those conversion rate figures. Consider the timing of your campaign, right? So if we remember this window of opportunity I talk about, how sometimes advertising just acts as a nudge in that right direction when a person is in that window of opportunity. The rest of the time, they kind of just tune out, don't even really care about your product or your ads. But if you get them at the right time, then it might just take one exposure in order to convert them. And so, seasonal products are a good example of where timing is really important. If it doesn't matter how much you advertise soup in the hot summer months, no one really wants to eat soup at that time. But now, coming into winter, if someone comes across one of your ads about a really, nice, warm soup in the middle of winter, that could push them in the right direction, and you will get a much higher conversion rate if you focus your advertising in the winter months rather than spreading it out throughout the year. And finally, consider those creative elements of your ad. So if you recall in the creative strategy lecture, we talked about how, creativity is important because it breaks through the clutter. It gets the people feeling the right way about your product. It resonates with them, or it causes some sort of emotional reaction so that they can really think about your brand as a potential option when they're in that window of opportunity. So convincing campaigns should theoretically have a higher conversion rate, right? Because if you see something that's really convincing because it's been made in a really creative and impactful way, then you should be more likely to purchase that brand than its competing brand that doesn't have that same convincing creative campaign. So if you really have confidence in the ad campaign that you've come up with, you should be able to argue for, a higher conversion rate, because you really understand how the elements of those ads that you've come up with really work together and really resonate with that target market in order to really make them convert and do what you want them to do based on your ad. Okay, I hope you guys found that useful in terms of trying to figure out the return on investment for your overall campaign, but also if you choose to go into a little bit more detail, the individual media that you used in your campaign, which gives those clients, you know, a little bit more flexibility in terms of trying to pick and choose the aspects of the budget that you've proposed to spend. In talking about return on investment, we introduced the concept of conversion rates, and these are really important in terms of trying to figure out how many of the people you reach with your ad will actually end up doing what you want them to do. And in most cases, that means buying the actual product you're advertising. And once you know what percentage of people will be buying the product that you're advertising, you can figure out the profit based on the assignment briefs you get, but also information from the client who can tell you for X amount of units, we expect Y amount of profit. And once you have the profit, we know you can work out the return on investment calculation. Good luck with your assignment, guys.